Hi, my name is Goldman. I'm the director and founder of Goldman & Associates. Our firm has a primary focus on family law issues here in Michigan, and today we're going to continue our video series designed to educate and inform the public, so please subscribe to our channel. I want to talk about 3 ways to protect a retirement in a divorce, particularly in a messy divorce. People are always worried about divorces, amicable divorces, contested divorces, messy divorces, but one thing that is a subcategory of that is, it's one thing to have your marriage fall apart, it's another thing to lose your retirement. So in a scenario where a person's worked hard their whole life, there may be a concern that if we get divorced, everything that they worked for so many years may be in jeopardy. So what are some ways that we can protect the retirement accounts so that they are not jeopardized in a subsequent divorce? Well, a lot of people say the first way is by getting a prenuptial agreement. A prenuptial agreement which might say, for example, that in the event of a divorce, all the retirement and all the proceeds from the retirement stay with one person. And that's a good way to do it. The problem is that it only addresses one segment of the divorcing population. Maybe those people who were already collecting retirement or well into their retirement plans before they decide to remarry. Maybe it makes sense for them to consider a prenuptial. But what about, you got 2 young people, they're not thinking about divorces, they're not thinking about retirement, they're in their 20s. And then they're married 30 years, now they're in their 50s, and now the issue comes up. In a situation like that, a prenuptial agreement, that wouldn't make any sense. They wouldn't have even considered it at the time because when they got married, they had no assets. So what's the scenario? How do you protect in that situation? Well, I would say the second way you might do it is you've got to identify the assets. You've got to identify what are considered the retirement assets and what are not. And it's important to do that because sometimes it's really clear. You work for a company, they got a pension plan, you don't really have control over it because you're working for them, and that's like a retirement asset, and that's easily identified. But what about if it's a self-managed account? Like an IRA or something like that you're saving and you're managing that, you've got to make sure of certain things. It's got to be separated so that when you look to that account, it's got to be obvious to everybody that that is separate and distinct, that that is a retirement account that is not going to be subject to the same invasion as would be a different kind of account that's separated and secured, that's maybe an ERISA protected account or some kind of account like that. So you've got to look at those things. You got to remember one thing, that there's only so much the attorneys can do in protecting an account that you've accumulated during the marriage, because even if you separate it out, it's likely to be considered a marital asset, and there's going to be a reckoning. Now, a third thing to consider is you've got to, we said you've got to identify it, you've got to isolate that account too. What I mean by that is you've got to make sure not to commingle the asset, because then for sure it's going to be considered marital. You might be able to argue that certain assets that you accumulated before the marriage that are now bleeding into the marriage as you continue to contribute, that those should be at least in part separated, but it's going to be particularly more difficult if you've commingled it. So I will say this. Those may be 3 ways that you might be able to address your retirement accounts, but you have to understand one thing. The main protection you're going to have with respect to your retirement accounts is going to be that the accounts were accumulated before the marriage and you're only exposed toward risk of that which was developed during the marriage. So let's say it's a 401k. The 401k beforehand, that's going to be off the table, and that's going to be protected as compared to the 401k that's developed during the marriage, which is really going to be considered a marital asset. And there's going to be very little way of you to protect that. There's going to be very little way to you to shield that, because once it's a marital asset, it's going to be subject to division. If you have any questions about that, reach out, and we'll be glad to help you out.